Good evening and welcome to Redistricting in Connecticut, Drawing a Better Map. I'm John Dankosky of the Connecticut Mirror. I know that many of you are regular readers of the Connecticut Mirror, but I also realize that for events like this, we've got guests who are interested in the topic, but don't know much about what the Mirror does. So before we start, let me just take a minute to tell you about it. A bit more than 10 years ago, we started an independent nonprofit news service dedicated to covering policy and politics in our very small state of Connecticut. This was a reaction to layoffs at traditional newspapers that left far fewer seasoned reporters holding public officials and prominent residents accountable. In those 10 years, we've expanded our reach and won awards for our coverage of housing discrimination, healthcare, criminal justice reform, and a lot more. We've grown, but one thing hasn't changed. We're still nonprofit, which means we rely on our readers for support. So please take a look at the site if you haven't. It's ctmirror.org. It's very easy to sign up for our newsletters and also to donate. Thank you so much for your support. Now, something else that we do here at the Mirror is partner with other organizations that are working to make life just a little bit better in Connecticut. That's why we're thrilled to present this event in partnership with the League of Women Voters of Connecticut and Everyday Democracy. The League has been so instrumental, not just in this, but in so many panels that I've been part of in the past. They really are engaged in making sure that more Connecticut residents can vote more fairly. If you want to read more about redistricting, you can go to our page and you can click on the viewpoints section. There you can find 3 essays about the topic that have been generated as part of this collaboration with the League of Women Voters. Now, the 2020 census gave Americans a chance to redraw their district lines, and it could fundamentally shift the map of democracy. But we often wonder, is this system set up to provide the kind of change that is necessary, the kind of real system that is necessary? How can Connecticut use this opportunity to create an electoral system that serves its people? And what can we learn from experts outside our state about how to do things a bit better? So let me introduce our panelists first. Michael Lee is senior counsel for the Brennan Center's democracy program. His work focuses on redistricting, voting rights, and elections. He was the author of a widely cited blog on redistricting and election law that the New York Times called indispensable. He's a regular writer and commentator on election law issues. Michael, welcome to our program. Thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, absolutely. And I'm glad you could make it. I also want to welcome in Katie Visick, who's Florida State Director for All on the Line. She leads a statewide program to create awareness and action around the redistricting process via strategic partnerships and grassroots engagement. Katie, welcome to our program. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And Therese Grant is president of the League of Women Voters in the great state of Iowa. Of course, Iowa is one of those states that we all hear about every 4 years, and we're always thinking about them every 4 years. And it's so good, Therese, to talk about elections with someone in Iowa that has nothing to do with a presidential primary. So thank you so much for joining us.
And thank you so much for having me. It's great. Thank you.
Now, we've welcomed Katie and Therese here because their states have some similarities and some differences with the way that we do things here in Connecticut. I will say first, before we get started, that we reached out to members of Connecticut's redistricting committee, and they declined to take part because at the time, they hadn't really had their first meeting. Of course, they didn't have much to meet about because the census data hadn't been released yet. Now, they did get together to start work this week, just as the census numbers came out. That release, of course, was late because of the pandemic, and we've already heard that they don't expect to meet their next deadline of September 15th to draft a plan for new maps. I would like to suggest right now that we all get together and have this conversation again with some folks from Connecticut this fall. And one last housekeeping measure for the people who are taking part as the audience tonight. Feel free to ask questions. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can just click on that and you can put in your questions. I'll get to as many of them throughout the course of this hour as we possibly can. Hopefully, we'll get to a few that have to do with Connecticut issues that we can talk about, but also some national issues as well. Try to keep your questions short so that I can read them all. All right, let's get started after all of that. And I don't know, maybe, Michael, we can start with you and get some big picture takeaways. Not just of how the system is going to work, because we're going to dig into the nuts and bolts of redistricting, but maybe you can react to some of what you saw with the census release of this past week. Whenever the census numbers come out and we get different numbers as far as districts congressional districts for each state, there is always a lot of hand-wringing and thinking about who won, who lost. I guess from your perspective, what did you see in these census numbers that interest you?
Well, the census numbers that we got on Monday are just the first step in the process, and they tell us something, but they don't tell us necessarily a whole lot, because what we learned from the numbers are like how many people live in Connecticut, how many people live in New York, but we don't know where they live or anything about them, such as their age or race or ethnicity. And so, those are key components to sort of better understanding the numbers, and we won't get that data until mid-August, and some of the data will come in later than that. But there were some surprises in the data that came out on Monday, which is, namely a number of states that were expected to gain seats or gain a certain number of seats didn't gain all of the seats that they were expected to, or didn't gain seats at all. Whereas some states like New York that were expected to lose a fairly significant number of seats actually came close to not losing any. And so in particular, Arizona, Florida, and Texas were all expected to be the big gainers this cycle. Texas did gain 2 seats, but it was expected to gain 3. Florida was expected to gain 2 seats. It only gained 1. And Arizona, which was expected to gain a new seat, didn't gain any seats. In addition, California lost a seat. And so there's been a lot of speculation about whether this potentially points at a significant Latino undercount in the census, something that people have long been worried about. But we won't really know until more granular data comes out. The good news, on the other hand, is that states like New York, which do have a large Latino population, New York was widely projected to lose 2 seats. It came really close to, it ended up losing 1, and it came really close to losing 0. If 89 more New Yorkers had been counted, it would have lost 0. And so, there is good news, and because some of the investments that went into ensuring a full count.
I want to just quickly get to that 89 number, because here in Connecticut, I mean, New York is our neighbor, and there's an awful lot of people who read the Connecticut Mirror, who might be even watching tonight, who commute into New York every day, and they look to Albany at least as much as they look to Hartford in terms of policy and what newspapers they read. And when they woke up and read that if they counted 89 more people in the state of New York, there would be another congressional seat in New York, that's the sort of thing that makes you go, huh, is this system working exactly the way it's supposed to?
Well, you could look at it as a glass half full or a glass half empty sort of situation. Again, New York was widely expected to lose 2 seats, or come really close to losing 2 seats. It came really close to losing 0 seats. And that really is a testament to the investment that the state of New York and the city of New York put into getting people to participate in the census. And bear in mind that when people were participating in the census, it was right in the middle of the pandemic as New York was being hit really hard. And the fact that, somehow through all of that, people were nonetheless managed to complete the census in much higher numbers than expected. New York, I think, had one of the best response rates in the country. And that really is a testament to the investment that not only the government, but also community groups put in, because they recognize how much was at stake, because it's not only representation, right? It's also federal funding. $1.5 trillion in federal funds are allocated to states every year based on the results of the census. That's everything from education to transportation, and for that matter, vaccines. The number of vaccines that states got for COVID was in part determined by the 2010 census. And so, people recognize that it was really important to invest in the census, and it sort of paid off. Whereas in contrast, states like Texas, which is a very fast growing state, Texas decided to invest $0 in census turnout, and it fell short. So, it's almost certainly in part because, there weren't TV ads in Texas. There weren't people you weren't getting mailers. No one was calling you to say participate in the census. And so, I would probably look at New York as a glass like 90% full situation as opposed to a glass half empty.
Well, let's actually turn quickly then to Florida. And Katie, Michael's already said that Florida was expected to potentially pick up another congressional seat, fell a little bit short of that. Obviously, Florida is growing very fast. Maybe not in the same way as Texas. Florida did not invest in the type of get out the census exercise that a lot of other states did. What can you tell us from the ground in Florida? And how you are reacting to those numbers that came out.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll definitely piggyback on what Michael said. We don't have the complete data yet. And so we feel like it's a wait and see. We don't have that granular data that tells us who got counted and who didn't get counted. But it is absolutely something that groups on the ground are looking at. And again, we are similar to Texas in the fact that we did not put a committee together. The governor did not invest any funds. We had groups on the ground who were putting together partner-based outreach, and they did as good of a job as they possibly could. But that very much could have resulted in what we see as losing that extra representation. And so we are definitely looking to see what the data looks like once we get it in August or September.
And are you concerned about that Latino undercount that Michael and others have been talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the areas that we have seen a lot of population growth is Central Florida, and that happens to be one of the areas where there is a large and growing Latino population. And so to see that that's likely where that district is going to go, maybe that doesn't correlate in the representation that it should if we do end up with an undercount of that specific population. So it's definitely a wait and see type of thing.
Yeah, and that part of Florida too, a very large Latino population, a very large population of people who are from Puerto Rico originally. And that's one way in which Florida is very much like Connecticut. We have a very large Puerto Rican population here, people who go back and forth between the island and the mainland. We see in those census numbers that Puerto Rico lost a lot of population, not surprisingly, over the course of the last 10 years after the series of hurricanes and other incidents. So there is always a question about whether or not places like Florida and Connecticut will end up with more American citizens, residents of Puerto Rico who've decided to make their home in Orlando or in Hartford.
Mm-hmm.
I want to turn to Therese in Iowa. What did you see out of these numbers? Obviously, as we get the demographic numbers in the fall, it's going to mean things are going to change a little bit. But what did you see in your home state?
Well, in Iowa, really the situation hasn't changed that much. I was rather surprised that the population actually grew a little bit. And so in Iowa, we will retain our 4 congressional districts that we've had for some time. Now, the projection, however, is for the population to decline so that by the time we have a census done in 10 years, we will probably lose one of those congressional districts. But here in Iowa, we're just anxiously waiting for that final census data that, will help us determine much more about redistricting. So that's what we're waiting for.
Yeah, and Michael, and maybe before we turn to some other specifics about the way the redistricting process works, I think that these demographic trends questions are really important. And I think one thing for people to understand is how exactly the census numbers directly correlate with how many representatives each state has. For instance, here in Connecticut, we're the 4th slowest growing state. As a matter of fact, of the states that are growing at all, we are the slowest growing. There are 3 states that are losing population, but we grew about 1% over the course of the last 10 years. Many people would look at that and say, Connecticut shouldn't really have 5 congressional districts. We should have 4 or fewer. So how exactly does that work?
So there's a formula set in federal law that allocates the congressional seats among the states, and it starts with every state getting at least 1, right? So that takes 50 out of the 435 out, and then there are 385 seats left. And then there is this formula, which is a pretty automatic formula that calculates values for each state, and then assigns seats to states. But it all matters not only on how your state does, but also how other states do. So New York, 89 more people, New York would have had an additional congressional seat. Likewise, Minnesota, if 26 fewer people had filled out the census, then New York would have gotten the seat that Minnesota managed to retain. So it's a little bit of of both how you do and how other states do. And I will say, one of the things that many people have talked about is, whether the size of the U.S. House is too small, because the size of the U.S. House was set in 1929 when the country was a much smaller country. And so the districts were much more equally populated. But now, there's actually quite a bit of variance in the size of districts among states. So Montana, which picked up a second seat, its districts will have about 542,000 people. Whereas the Idaho, right next door to Montana, also has 2 seats, but its districts will have about 920,000 people. So like almost double the size. And that is a function, of the formula, but more importantly, the function of the fact that we only have 435 seats in a country that now is 331 million people, and that's probably not enough seats optimally. So.
Teresa, I don't know, people in Iowa who are so focused on electoral issues. I mean, we do hear so much about Iowa every 4 years. In much like New Hampshire in our backyard, people are engaged in the election process. They really care about some of these democratic norms. So is there talk in Iowa about that thing that Michael just brought up? The fact that somehow or other, we as a nation have grown exponentially over the course of the last 100 years, but yet somehow or other, we end up with the same 435, which makes it a little bit unfair when you start to split things up.
Well, I'm not sure if, Iowans in general are talking about it, but I know it's something that I certainly have considered. And I think maybe the League of Women Voters as well. But, these are issues about, we look at the Senate and we look at the House, how, disproportionately some states are represented. And so, I mean, this is an issue, and perhaps, in the future, this is something that can be addressed, around the country.
Katie, do you think about this at all?
Oh, absolutely. And to Teresa's point, for a state like Florida, we have 2 senators, right, who represent us. But then there's also, much less populated states who also have 2 senators. So it's something that I think people are starting to think more about. And it's definitely, I think, again, I don't know if everyone's talking about it yet, but it is starting to be talked about a lot more, especially, even in my work with redistricting and talking about gerrymandering. You do see a little bit more awareness in comparison to the last decade when this process happened. So I do think people are starting to become more aware.
So, Michael, let's get into this. If you get stuck in an elevator with someone and you talk to them about what you do, and they said, I don't really understand this whole redistricting thing. What do you tell them in a quick way to explain the process by which we redraw district lines, not just these congressional district lines, but district lines in state legislatures as well? What do you say to people?
Well, I guess I would start. I've never had to do this in an elevator, so I'm trying to imagine that. But
it's a long elevator ride.
A long elevator ride. I always start we draw districts so that we determine who's in power. And in this country, we have elections every 2 years because the framers, the founding generation, thought that, as the mood of the people shifted, so should the composition of legislature, so should the composition of Congress. And what happens when we draw the lines instead is oftentimes people put their thumb on the scale so that they sort of predetermine the results of elections. And so we really, in many cases, don't actually need to have the election because we already know who's going to win, which is really anathema to the whole purpose of this. And what I do is we work on reforms and work on ways to sort of make the process better so that it's more true to the founding generation's vision, which is that the legislatures of the country, Congress should be an exact portrait, a miniature of the people as a whole. And that's really what we want, because that's the Congress should be, the U.S. House at least should be a miniature of the American people, in all of its diversity, political diversity, ethnic diversity, regional diversity. And unfortunately, that doesn't happen because we also have another long American tradition, sort of a dark tradition of putting our thumb on the scale and drawing maps so that we favor certain incumbents or favor certain political parties. And that's what I think a lot of groups are fighting against.
Is the goal to make districts that are more competitive so that we don't just know who's always going to get elected and we almost don't have to have the election? Or is the goal to truly represent the people who live in that particular area? Because in some ways, those two things could work together, but in some ways, those things are very divergent ideas.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, I mean, and that's a good point because, there are places, I live in Brooklyn, New York, where there are a lot of Republicans, and it could be, you really can't draw districts that are competitive for Republicans if your life depended on it. Likewise, in West Texas, it's very hard to draw districts that are, um, competitive for Democrats, right? And that's okay. That is just a function of the area, and you shouldn't try to have competitiveness at all cost. But on the other hand, there are many places where if you just sort of plop down a district size shape on the state and didn't sort of try to rig it in any way, the district would have a fair amount of competitiveness, right? Just because you were keeping communities together, and as community mood shifts, who wins would also shift. Now, that doesn't happen everywhere. There are places that are very Democratic and some places that are very Republican, and that's okay. But what happens, unfortunately, is that in places where you could have competition, people decide to take that competition out and to sort of engineer it out of the system. And that's where it becomes problematic, because then you end up like, take North Carolina, which is a 50-50 state. Republicans drew a map that gave them 10 out of 13 congressional seats, a 10-3 map. Pennsylvania had a 13-5 map, and another 50-50 state. Ohio, close to a 50-50 state, had a 12-4 map in favor of Republicans. And that's sort of the putting your thumb on the scale that is sort of very anti-democratic.
So Katie, from your perspective in Florida, maybe you can talk about what some of the problems are with the districting process there, and what your organization, what All on the Line, tries to do.
Absolutely. I'll start with the fact that it is a fully run legislative process that occurs in Florida. And there's not a lot of rules around the actual process itself. Now, we have rules around what maps should look like and what criteria, but the process itself can either be transparent or not transparent, depending on what the legislature feels, right? And so I can give you a story of the 2012 process. The leadership at the time said this was going to be the most transparent redistricting process ever. They created a map portal for citizens to be able to say, like, this is what I think the state should look like. This is where my community is. Well, it was through litigation that we actually found out that political partisan operatives already had the maps drawn. And then they sent folks to the hearings to submit maps that the political partisan operatives drew. So they really took advantage of the process, right? Now, I think the one shining light in Florida is we have what are called the Fair District Amendments. And so it does put some boundaries around what districts should look like. It bans partisan gerrymandering. It bans the intent to favor or disfavor a political party or an incumbent. It also has protections for racial and language minorities, for folks to be able to elect representatives of their choice. It tries to make sure districts are compact in that they're as nearly equal in population as possible. And so the problem is the legislature doesn't always have to follow those, right? So even though that is the guidelines, what we saw is completely gerrymandered maps. Those amendments were passed by voters in 2010. 2012 was the first redistricting process that occurred afterwards. The legislature completely passed gerrymandered maps, and it took over 4 years of litigation to get us to the place where we are now. And so we have fair congressional maps and we have more fair Senate maps, but it took the courts to really get us there. And so what All on the Line is really focusing on is, one, demanding transparency and true transparency, making sure people are involved and educated on the process, but also trying to get elected officials to commit and going on record about following the Fair District Amendment. So we're starting that drumbeat early and now, and we're trying to get legislators to actually sign a pledge to follow the Fair District Amendments. And so, that's the angle that we're taking now. But, again, because it is a legislative process, they have not started the committee process. They have not named anyone to the committees. And, our Senate leader was quoted as saying the other day, we really haven't given much thought to the redistricting process. Maybe we'll think about it sometime this summer. And the data is going to be coming, right? And that's not going to give folks enough time for public input. So we're kind of in this wait and see mode to see what they're actually going to do.
So Micah, I'd love for you to comment a little bit on that, because I think there's a lot to unpack in what Katie just said there. I mean, there's the problem of transparency, certainly. You want to know what they're doing. if you write some statutes, the public has spoken and we say, we want you to do it a certain way, you should probably listen to what they're saying. But then there's also that question of we haven't given much thought to it. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of lawmakers, if they are in legislative districts that are drawn a certain way, it protects their incumbency. What is their incentive, frankly, to get together and meet and do anything about it if it's just going to mean maybe they lose their job? So I don't know. It seems like there's a lot of problems they're trying to solve in Florida. What are some takeaways for you?
Yeah. So Florida, they ultimately ended up doing just a criteria only fix, which is to say they strengthened the rules around redistricting. They did not take map drawing power away from the legislature, which is what has been done in states like California and Arizona and Michigan. And you're absolutely right, as Katie pointed out, sometimes lawmakers, give sort of the middle finger, as it were, to the process, right? And in Florida, it happened to backfire on them because they wrote a lot of the stuff in emails, forgetting that the email stands for evidence, right? And so all of that came out in litigation, and you had a very good Florida Supreme Court at the time, which has gotten worse since then, which was willing to sort of enforce the rules. And so, having stronger rules goes a long way toward making the process better. But the reality is that Florida, they weren't able to do a redistricting commission, because there was concern, particularly from communities of color, about how communities of color would be able to fare with a commission. But the good news is that redistricting reform is not one size fits all, right? I think Florida took a big step in the right direction with the Fair Districts Amendment, but there could be other things that could be done that also could strengthen the process. And, the biggest predictor of whether a state will have problems with redistricting or not is whether one party can control the process. When one party controls the process, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, that's an open invitation to gerrymander maps and to discriminating against communities of color. And simply breaking up that one party monopoly through, whether it's by taking power away, giving it to a commission, or by requiring a supermajority, as Connecticut does, or requiring a supermajority and with a certain level of support from the minority party, as Ohio has done, goes a long way, because then the process either deadlocks and it goes to a court, or the parties end up compromising. But simply taking away the power from one party to decide what they want to do by themselves, is really the key to successful reform. And there are lots of different ways to get there.
So Teresa, let me turn to you. I mean, what are some of the issues in Iowa in terms of the way your redistricting process works, and what is the league there doing to change some things?
Well, today we're not doing too much because this happened 30, 40 years ago. The process that we have in Iowa is a nonpartisan process. And the league actually got help to get that started, because this was back in 1971 when the map was drawn. It was said to be gerrymandered. And so the league, along with a couple other organizations, filed a lawsuit. And as a result of that lawsuit back in 1972, we have a process today where the legislative maps are drawn by an agency that is nonpartisan. It's the Legislative Services Agency. So our job today is to monitor that process, to make sure, and it's in the Constitution, it's in the code, that this is the way it's done in Iowa. This is an agency that is not composed of any legislators whatsoever. They are independent. They draw the maps once the data is received. And then another thing that happens in Iowa is that there is a commission. It's the Temporary Redistricting Advisory Commission. And it's composed of 5 individuals. 4 of them are appointed by the majority and minority General Assembly. And the 5th is chosen by this commission as this person is the chairperson. And their job then, once the first map is drawn, they will go around and they will have public hearings, at least 3 public hearings in the state of Iowa, so that this first map, once it's drawn, it becomes public. People in Iowa can see it, they can look at it, and at these public hearings, they can comment to say, yes, this looks great, because it's all about equal, equal population in throughout the districts. And so this commission then will hold these hearings, and after the hearings, they will write a report. They will send it to the legislature. Now the legislature, then they're involved. They will say yes or no to the plan. And this can happen 3 different times. The LSA can draw maps. If it's said no the first time, they draw a second map. The third time, they at this point, the legislature can actually amend the plan, but it hasn't gone to that third map in, like I said, since 1972. It's either been approved either the first or second plan. So this is something that we watch, the league watches to make sure that, in the past there have been no changes in the way that redistricting is done. And we will certainly keep an eye on what happens once we get the data and in September and follow the process.
So Michael, does this seem like a fairer, a better way of doing this than, say, what Florida does or what Connecticut does?
Well, the Iowa model, no question, has been really successful. But I think even as some of the folks involved in Iowa, at the Legislative Services Agency would tell you, they're not sure that it translates well to other states. In part because, there's a lot of trust built in the system, and that's, something that's sort of cultural to Iowa that it doesn't necessarily exist in other states. So I come from Texas, for example, originally, and, the Texas legislature is probably very different culturally than Iowa. In addition, Iowa is, it's fairly demographically uniform, right? And the population is fairly evenly spread out. It's the growth is fairly even, and most importantly, it's a very white state, so you don't have a lot of the complexities about representing communities of color in the same way that you would in, say, Texas or New York, and that is something. So Iowa's criteria are very mechanical, and that works really well if you don't have to do things like comply with the Voting Rights Act. And so people even in Iowa have testified elsewhere that Iowa is a great model, but it doesn't necessarily work well for every state, but it is something certainly to consider, because we are very unique in the sense that we leave map drawing right now to lawmakers who are self-interested in the process, as people have pointed out. And like we have a problem with gerrymandering, like no other sort of modern democracy really has that level of problem. It's an American exceptionalism in a bad way. So Iowa is certainly something to look at, but there are things to consider.
Well, I mean, we've talked a lot about gerrymandering, and I think that, if you look at some Connecticut maps, you can see some instances of that. Michael, I don't know if maybe you just want to quickly say, give people in Connecticut an example of what real gerrymandering looks like when it's really taken to its ultimate extreme. How bad can gerrymandering get?
Well, if you look at, again, the Pennsylvania, the North Carolina maps, Pennsylvania was 13-5 for Republicans in the congressional delegation. North Carolina was 10-3 in favor of Republicans in the congressional delegation of 50-50 states. And those maps really sort of stuck, which is something that we didn't used to see in the past. But, the data and the technology are getting so much better that you can draw maps that really sort of stick for the whole of the decade, that don't break down over the course of the decade. But to sort of imagine something that is like a really aggressive gerrymander, the city of Austin in Texas is, split up into 6 different congressional districts. One of them stretches all the way to Fort Worth, which is about 4 hours to the north. One of them stretches to Houston, which is about 4 hours to the east. Another stretches to San Antonio. Another stretches into West Texas. So you get the sense, I mean, and that is, really to neutralize, this very liberal pocket of voters in Austin. Which, whether, if you've ever been to Austin, you may like it, you may hate it, but it is a unique city. It's the 11th largest city in the country. It has unique needs, unique industries, unique needs, and it doesn't anchor a single congressional district because, it was split apart and fractured into different districts in order to maximize, Republican power. The other thing I will say is that in much of the country, the thing that's important to understand about gerrymandering is that it almost always comes at the expense of communities of color. Austin is perhaps an exception, but especially in the South, there still aren't enough white Democrats to sort of like really use white Democrats as the means to gerrymander, right? That instead it's, Democrats only get about 28% of the white vote in most of the South. And the problem with white Democrats is that they live close to white Republicans, sometimes in the same house. And so unless you're drawing the line down somebody's bed, you really can't gerrymander very effectively. Because of residential segregation, it's much easier to split apart or pack together communities of color in order to move the dial up or down on its political effect. And so even though people talk about this as a partisan issue, it actually is a racial justice issue as well.
I want to get to some of the questions that some of our audience is peppering in, and I'll start actually with one from CW that says, in Iowa, why are legislators allowed to accept or not accept the maps? Yeah, go ahead, Therese.
Well, it's a part of the process. I mean, that was the way it was set up back in 1970s or so, and so the maps are drawn, but the legislator then gets to vote yes or no. And but this is what happens with that third map. If that third map, is passed, and if there's any question about it whatsoever, if one individual or an organization, for example, has a problem with that last map that is approved by the legislature, then it will go to the Supreme Court. The court will have the final say. So therefore, it's all supposed to be, fair and equal. And if anybody objects, it will go to the Supreme Court.
We have a question here from Carol, who asks, can you address the use of computers now to draw maps down to the street and even a house? I don't know, Katie, how much you watch this, but we've talked about this a little bit. There are ways to draw maps now using computer programs that are quite a bit different than the way it was done decades or a century ago. This really does change things, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Technology has changed how the redistricting process works. Just to share a story from the last process, how detailed you can get down to that house level has changed the process. And so I heard the story once, and it just always sticks with me, that there was a legislator, I can't remember what state, but he didn't want his ex-wife in his district anymore. And thus he was able to get down to that level and draw her out, right? And then we actually have Florida-specific examples like this, right? Where they took out a condominium complex that a legislator lived and just wrapped right around it, and then he could no longer run in that district anymore. So if you can get down to that street level, it opens up for more strategic gerrymandering.
How bad is the gerrymandering process in Florida right now? I mean, I asked Michael about some of the national examples, but I mean, I think this would be instructive for a lot of residents of Connecticut, because within a few years, they're all going to move to Florida anyway, which is following the trend. And so, I mean, maybe you can enlighten folks about just how bad it is right now in Florida.
Well, I think a lot of people assume it's probably really bad in Florida, right? But because of the litigation, our congressional maps in our Senate maps, they are pretty fair. Now, our house maps, our state house maps, they're not. They're actually very, what we would call overpacked with voters, and the coasts especially. And like what Michael was talking about, a lot of these communities of color are overpacked, which then creates districts around it that are much more white. And so that also is a gerrymandering strategy. And so you see a little bit of that in the Florida maps. But our congressional maps right now, in our state house maps, we got those right before the 2016 elections. We haven't had them that long, so we're not quite used to having these fairer maps. But that is what we're operating under right now, and what we're trying to really hold on to, especially because these maps were recently passed and recently litigated on. A lot of our stances across organizations working here in Florida is try to keep the maps as similar as possible. Obviously, you need population changes, but use those maps as benchmark maps, and then really start those house maps from scratch. And so that's what our end goal here in Florida is.
Michael, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about our state of Connecticut here. A lot of people are asking me questions about Connecticut in the process. It is a political process. The political process in Connecticut is controlled, and has been for quite some time, almost entirely by Democrats. But that having been said, down at the town level, there are certainly Republicans who control some town committees. I guess a big question for a state like Connecticut is how to draw a map that is both fair and competitive, especially in such a small, compact area. When you're talking about Texas, God's sakes, if you get in the car and go 4 hours from Connecticut, you're in Maine or Pennsylvania. So I don't know, how do you react to how Connecticut does what it does? Oh, I think you're muted, Mike.
No, I am muted. Sorry about that. Connecticut actually does, pretty well compared to other states. And I know, like, when I go around the country, everybody always wants to say our state is the worst. And, like this inevitably, other than Iowa people are very proud of their model. But most states you go to, people want to tell you about like how the maps are not well drawn. But, Connecticut, because it has a two-thirds majority requirement in the legislature, even though it's a political process. And, right now, in the House, there is not a Democratic two-thirds majority, unless things have changed more recently. But, so that means that there has to be at least some level of compromise. You have to get some support from the other party. Now, there's probably more that could be done to make the process fair. But that, it's I would say it's a solid B, even a B+ process overall. Some of the things that could be done to perhaps strengthen it, or to strengthen some of the rules, even though it's left in the legislature, the reality is, if you go and you look at the rules in most states, there are relatively few rules, even for state legislative redistricting. But certainly for congressional redistricting, there's oftentimes almost no rules, and that leaves a lot of room for mischief. And so simply telling the legislature what you want, telling them what order they're supposed to apply the rules, goes a long way. It helps with litigation if it comes to that, right? And certainly, even though, as most people know, the U.S. Supreme Court has stepped out of policing partisan gerrymandering, saying like you can't bring claims into the federal Constitution. Some state courts have been willing to police partisan gerrymandering under state constitutions, but there are things that you could do to make sure that they do, like writing that into the state constitution or writing it into law. That goes sort of a long way to making the process a lot better. And in terms of competition, they say value, they can be factored in there. But again, as we talked about earlier, it's not always clear that you want competition, right? Sometimes if you try to draw a competitive district in Brooklyn, right, which is, I live in a state assembly district where Barack Obama got 98% of the vote, and Hillary Clinton got 96% of the vote, and Donald Trump was a third place finisher. And so you really can't draw, very competitive districts where I live, unless you were to really draw them out into Westchester or into, way out into Long Island or something like that. And that's not what you would want either. So I think competition is something that people oftentimes value, but, you have to sort of like, it has to be competition where it's sort of realistic, right? And sometimes it's not realistic.
Therese, you made reference to this before, and I sort of want to get back to this. Obviously, no matter how the state works, whether it's a fully legislative process or whether it's some sort of an independent process, everyone was waiting this time around for census numbers, which were delayed by the pandemic. And I think we all understand these are somewhat extenuating circumstances. That having been said, this is such an incredibly important process. It only gets to happen every 10 years. And when, we hear that, maybe in Florida or Connecticut, they haven't really met very much, if at all, to talk about this, it seems as though this is something that, if nothing else, we could fix by just taking it a little bit more seriously, like starting work on this a year or so ago. I mean, there's a lot that we can learn from the Iowa example, but I think part of it is just paying more attention to it, except, and not just in this 1 month or this 1 year.
Well, exactly right. And, I've heard them, different comments today about, no rules. I mean, you should see, the Iowa code, there are strict rules about this process, and these rules go into effect every year. And, I mean, having an established process and something that's done every single year, this is the way we do it, and this is how we do it, I think that really helps, and also, like, I think the transparency also, like I talked about, having this commission that holds public hearings. I think that is also something that really helps the process, that people understand it and they have confidence in it.
A lot of people have asked some variation of this question. What can residents in Connecticut do to help ensure our maps are drawn fairly? Who wants to jump in?
Well, I think that people can, as the process goes forward, there will be opportunities to participate in the process, and that input is very important. Whether it's, and the good news is that there are more publicly available tools for people to draw their own maps and to submit their own maps than there were in the past. It used to be like, you really couldn't do that, but now you sitting at home, as we're all doing because of the pandemic, you can draw maps to your heart's delight, and but better yet, you can get together with other people in your community and say, hey, let's sort of figure out what we want as a community, and what works for us and what we like and don't like about the existing maps and how we could be better represented. There are organizations, the league, various all on the line chapters and Common Cause. There are lots of groups that are sort of helping to organize people. I would not underestimate the power of community maps to sort of drive the conversation, right? Because they provide a powerful alternative to what happens sometimes inside the dome, where maps sometimes get manipulated. But when you have these community alternatives, that people that have broad buy-in, people that does influence the process, and sometimes it even influences the outcome in court. In Virginia, the legislature defended a very bad map on the basis they were trying to avoid splitting counties. And yes, it created a bad, partisan effect, but they were just trying to avoid splitting counties, and that partisan effect was just the side effect of that. But it turns out that there was a map drawn at a student competition that actually split fewer counties than the state's map, and didn't have that partisan effect. And the court said, I don't quite buy what you're saying, because like the student managed to do what you said you're trying to do and did it better, and he didn't have this partisan effect. And so, it actually does impact. And again, the good news is that there are lots of tools for people to do this, and lots of people organizing around this, because it used to be redistricting was something that nobody cared about. But now people really do care about it. and lots of people are going to be engaged on it. So.
Hey, Katie, I'd love your thoughts on this, because this is the space you work in.
Yeah, I think obviously demanding transparency early. So I think what a lot of legislators, especially now because of this delay in census data, they're going to lean on the fact that it's late, and then they're not going to have a transparent process if they're not mandated to. And so I think starting those calls early is really, really important. I also agree with public input, right? Community mapping is what a lot of groups in Florida are doing. So trying to hear from communities, trying to mark where communities are. So there's something to really bring to the public input space. And I think another thing is making sure that you can actually comment on draft maps, because in Florida, what happened is we had these public hearings, right? We had 26 public hearings in 2012 across the state, where the line was, we want to hear from you. But then when it came to the actual draft maps, people weren't really able to comment on them as much. There wasn't that space. So making sure when you're talking about public input, also making sure you're being specific and saying you want to comment on the draft maps. You can even take it further, right? And ask for, any map drawing session to not be able to be done in a back room, that it has to be done in front of the public so people can actually see the process unfold. And I think if you can start those calls for action earlier, I do think starting that drumbeat early could make change in the process, if there especially isn't an official one that the legislators have to follow.
Therese, since we're talking so much about map drawing, though, I think it's important to point out that, if you don't know very much about this process, you could look at a whole lot of maps that are drawn and say, well, that doesn't make any sense. I don't think of this town as being anything like this other town, or you couldn't possibly imagine that your community is lumped in with some other community. But the fact is, these maps have to take more into account than just geography, right? They don't have to just look pretty on the page. They have to serve an important function. So I guess I'm wondering how you think about that. about presenting maps sometimes that might be counterintuitive to people who live someplace, but actually preserve the function that they're trying to do, which is have a fair election, a fair district.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't know about, the rest of the state, how things are done in the rest of the country, but in Iowa, the maps are done by population, and it doesn't matter. I mean, they don't take into any kind of account as far as, politics or anything like that. So the maps that are drawn here in Iowa, especially when we talk about the state maps, the counties have to be, contiguous, and the population has to be, minus 1%, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's very, very compact the way things are done here. And, that's what I've always known. And that's the way it's done. And it seems to be a very, very fair process. Population, I mean, that's the thing, to make it fair. When you get to the cities, it's a little bit, a little bit more complicated, but out in the rural areas, these counties are just, they're never split, and even you can't even just have them touch in the corner; they have to be side by side. So that's what we do here in Iowa.
Yeah, and that's what we try to do around the country. It seems like Iowa has it figured out a little bit better than a lot of places. A couple just real quick rapid fire questions here from people. Jeff asks a question about how much actual influence do state and federal office holders have over redistricting. He's under the impression that state legislators work in a bipartisan way to protect state incumbents, and people like Rosa DeLauro or John Larson push to make their districts as uncompetitive as possible. All right, so that's Jeff's question. Mike, I'll just put that to you. I mean, obviously this is happening at the state legislative level, but how much realistic impact do, say, senators and congresspeople in Washington have over this process?
Well, when it's a legislative process, they oftentimes have a lot of say. I mean, that's the reality. And they oftentimes really dictate the way that maps are drawn. And Jeff is absolutely right that there oftentimes are bipartisan deals that are cut. California had a really infamous bipartisan gerrymander where both parties agreed in 2001 to protect each other's seats. And it was so successful that out of 459 legislative and congressional races between 2001 and 2010, only one incumbent lost all decade, right? And so, incumbency protection is a problem. We talked a lot about favoring one party or the other, but incumbency protection is oftentimes something that also happens. And the reality is, elected officials at both the state and local levels oftentimes have, and congressional levels have a lot of say in the process. But it's much better when you have a nonpartisan process, like like Iowa's or like in California, where you have a commission drawing the maps, because then the map drawer really is isolated from that.
Very quickly on the California model, or a model that's different than Iowa's. I mean, you can't take politics completely out of the process. Many people would say, if my lawmaker isn't taking part in it and it's some commission, a lot of people don't trust it. They say it's a room full of hooded figures making up district maps behind closed doors. How do you guard against a fear that if you take it out of the legislature's purview, you don't have fairness or accountability?
Well, what makes California's commission and other independent commissions really successful is that they have a series of checks and balances, right? They don't depend on having perfect map drawers. They recognize that people have interest, and sometimes you may have people who have bad intent. But the thing is that they are the decider of the process, right? In California, there are 14 members of the commission, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 4 independents or third-party people. And to pass a map, you have to have not only a majority of the commission, but you have to have 2 people from the Democratic bucket, 2 people from the Republican bucket, and 2 people from the independent third-party bucket, right? In other words, so it's not as though Democrats and independents can get together and screw Republicans or vice versa. You really do have to have bipartisan support for a map, and that goes a long way. There's lots of transparency and other provisions, and the commissioners themselves are screened for conflicts of interest. They can't be too closely tied to the political process. They have to undergo this 90-minute interview before 3 auditors. It's a really complicated process to get on the California Commission. So none of this guarantees there won't be rogue actors or that people won't come in with bad motive, but even if they do, they're checks and balances, and that's really what makes the system work. Because again, the goal is not to let one group decide everything.
One thing I want to make sure that we get to that a lot of people in Connecticut really want to change about the Connecticut system is a process called prison gerrymandering. The idea that you would count prisoners in the place that they are currently housed in a correctional facility, sometimes in a rural community, as opposed to their home communities. There are any number of reasons why that's a problem, right? Resources will flow to that host community as opposed to the towns or cities where the people originally are from. Michael or Katie or Therese, I don't know how much you take a look at this particular process around the country, but it just seems like this is something that when people first hear about it, they say, how can that possibly be? How can we count prisoners where they're incarcerated as opposed to where they're from?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that the Census Bureau considered changing for this census. It decided not to do so because it had a lot of other things that were going on. But it's something certainly that the Census Bureau could change just in the way that it collects the data. You know, there probably would have to be some federal funding that goes along with that to help states do this, because the one thing that happens is that people who are incarcerated don't fill out the census themselves. The prisons fill it out for them. And you know, sometimes they have the information readily available. Some states have very modern systems, but other states like Louisiana, you know, there's no reason for them to know like your old address. They just don't need it. They need to know how long you're in there for, whether you're dangerous or not, but they don't need to know where you used to live. And they do have that information, but it's written on paper in file cabinets. And so for them to do that, they'd have to like go through the file cabinet to do that. So helping states modernize how they track that information would be something that would be helpful. Some states have dealt with prison gerrymandering internally just by reallocating people to where they used to be. But that, of course, only addresses redistricting. It doesn't address like the federal funds that come, you know, because the federal government will still do the block grants based on, you know, the federal census.
Katie, is this something that you're talking about in Florida?
Yeah, it's something that more and more groups are starting to talk about. We had legislation filed to try to stop prison gerrymandering. You know, we have a Republican trifecta in Florida. It did not go anywhere, but it's been filed for the last couple of years. And so it's something that folks are starting to pay more attention to.
I'll leave it at that and maybe get one quick thought from each of you. And Katie, I'll come to you first. When you say the words, something people should pay more attention to, I guess that's what I'd like to leave us with. If you got a chance to tell people, what should you be paying more attention to at this stage, right? We just got the census data. More data is going to come in the fall. We're not really going to have these district maps drawn until sometime early next year before the next election cycle in 2022. So right now, what are you telling people, Katie, to pay attention to?
It's going to go back to the same answer, right? Transparency and what's the process, and learning what that process is, taking the time to educate yourself on redistricting, gerrymandering, learning your state's process, and where you see gaps, calling it out early.
Therese, how about you?
Yeah, I would echo what Katie's saying too. You know, the process is going to start in September, and the Supreme Court has already said that, you know, they're going to, even though it's going to be late, they're going to let it the process go the way it should go, the way it always has gone. But it's a little bit vague, and so I think people need to pay attention to the process and make sure that it's done the way it's always done in Iowa.
If everyone could just do it the way Iowa does it.
Well, not everybody is Iowa, but you know, we have a good process here and we're proud of it.
Fair enough. Not everyone is Iowa. Michael, how about you? I'll give you the last word.
I would just say, you know, be mindful of, you know, how, you know, redistricting will take place later than normal this year, which means that it will be oftentimes rushed, and that there will be potentially efforts to game the process and to take shortcuts and to make excuses for not doing everything that you should be doing. And, you know, but now, between now and mid-August, when the next round of data comes out, you know, this is the time to push to make sure that the process is open, transparent, and that states are doing everything that they need to do, including potentially moving primary dates in some of the states with early primaries, to make sure that there's enough room, because getting, you know, this maps will stick for the whole of the decade. It's important to get this right.
Yeah.
Moving primary dates that's a whole different conversation, and a very important one. I'll tell you what, we should have this conversation again in the fall. I will say that at least one member of the committee, the legislative committee, that is doing this in Connecticut was watching tonight. So thank you very much for that. And we will rejoin this conversation in the fall. I want to thank Michael, Katie, and Therese so much for your expertise. Thank you so much for spending the time with us. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Of course. And thank you. I've learned so much about all of these other states and also about Connecticut. Let's keep this conversation going. I really want to thank the folks from the League of Women Voters Connecticut who did so much to put this together. They've been such great partners with me in terms of doing political debates over the years and just bringing all these issues to the forefront. I want to thank the folks at the League of Connecticut. I also want to thank Everyday Democracy for their support of this project. Thanks to Bruce Putterman, the publisher of the Connecticut Mirror. And I'll just make one last pitch. The Connecticut Mirror exists because of people like you who like to have conversations like this, who want to learn about the world around them, who want to learn about policy and politics and how things work. If you can support the Connecticut Mirror, even if you can support your nonprofit local journalism in Iowa and in Brooklyn and in Florida, that will go a long way toward a better democracy. If you want to support the Mirror, it's ctmirror.org and just click on that little donate button. I'm John Dankosky. Thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. Have a lovely night and go vote.